Good evening. My name is Frank Howland. I'm a professor of economics, and I'm also the chair of the PPE steering committee here at Wabash College. I'd like to welcome you to the opening event of a colloquium which marks the 60th anniversary of the publication of Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom. Friedman traced the origins of the book to a series of lectures he gave at this college in June of 1956 at the invitation of two legendary Wabash College professors, Ben Rogie and John Van Sickle. He came out with the book 6 years later with a great deal of help from his wife, Rose Friedman. Friedman, who was born in 1912 and died in 2006, was not only a brilliant Nobel Prize-winning economist, but also a major public intellectual. Capitalism and Freedom is a definitive statement of his view that capitalism is an essential guarantor of economic freedom and a prerequisite for political freedom. In the book, Friedman applies his economic philosophy to consider important issues of public policy. What he had to say 60 years ago is still highly relevant to us today. Two examples among many. First, Friedman advocated for replacing government-supplied K-12 schooling with a voucher system whereby parents could pay for education at schools of their choice. Second, Friedman proposed a negative income tax. While that exact proposal did not come to pass, there's a program called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which subsidizes the wages of low-income Americans. And it is by far the largest cash support for lower-income citizens in the United States today. In the book, Friedman employs the philosophical perspective of classical liberalism to offer prescriptions on the proper role of government in economic affairs. Thus, it is very appropriate for the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, PPE for short, to sponsor this colloquium. PPE is a multidisciplinary major which began in the 2019-2020 academic year. PPE majors learn to investigate the social phenomena that the disciplines of philosophy, political science, and economics address from different perspectives using various methods. Through a multidisciplinary approach to practical problems, the PPE major offers a liberal arts education that prepares students for leadership in policy-oriented fields in business and for being informed and engaged citizens. I'd like to thank several people who did essential work in bringing this colloquium to life. The original idea for this colloquium came from Jeff Gower, a professor of philosophy. Jeff and his colleagues on the PPE steering committee, Nick Snow and Lorraine McCrary, professors of economics and political science respectively, spent many hours planning the colloquium. Richard Page has provided publicity and arranged for recording all the public talks. Absolutely essential support was supplied by Pam Sacco, the academic administrative coordinator for Division III at the college. Finally, we are extremely grateful to the Dr. Jim Lau, Class of 73 PPE Fund, and the Wabash Public Policy Project for providing funding support for the colloquium. The colloquium begins with tonight's keynote address by Professor Michael Munger of Duke University. There will be two other public events, both of which will be held in this room. Tomorrow at noon, Professor Adam Kotsko of North Central will deliver a second keynote speech, and the colloquium will conclude with a panel discussion featuring both professors and being moderated by Professor Snow from 4:15 to 5:30 p.m. tomorrow. Also on Friday, PPE students will attend seminars offered by our visiting professors to discuss several chapters from Capitalism and Freedom. Now I'd like to yield the podium to Nick Snow, the Tom and Ann Walsh Professor of Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. Nick will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Howland. I'm really excited to do this. I've been very excited about this since Jeff came up with the idea, or sorry, Professor Gower came up with the idea. It's my honor to introduce our first keynote. Michael Munger is the professor of political science, economics, and public policy at Duke University, where he's also the director of undergraduate studies and the director of their PPE program. He is a very accomplished scholar in the field of public choice economics, where he's published 200 plus journal articles, many of which, one of which at least we read in PPE 200, as well as 8 authored books, as well as numerous edited volumes. Of the authored books, just to name a few, is the book Choosing in Groups, which looks at public choice issues of collective action. Tomorrow 3.0, which looks at the gig economy and sharing economy. And relevant for tonight is Capitalism Sustainable, which I'm really happy I just got right. I've been really nervous about it because, as some of you may know, Ben Rogie has a book that's of his collected essays called Can Capitalism Survive?, which I've been very, very nervous about mixing up. So I didn't. Little known fact, just a fun fact, he's also an accomplished actor, which many of you have seen. He's in the famous Keynes Hayek rap videos, which my Hayek class just witnessed this week. In the first one, he plays a member of the gig economy who takes Hayek and Keynes on a trip through New York in his limo. And in the second one, he is a security guard who takes Hayek down the road to serfdom, which is very relevant for today, as the road to serfdom is actually mentioned multiple times in Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman as a huge influence. Friedman was very concerned with the relationship between political and economic freedom. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Munger.
Well, thanks very much. That was completely uncalled for. I have become, I'm going to take my mask off. I have become interested in what Milton Friedman thought in a way that might be characterized as liberal philosophy. So I have a book that I've been halfway finished with for about 5 years, where I look at 10 different economists and try to interpret what their writing was about for a philosophy audience. So I was originally catechized as an economist, but I've been apostate from that path from a long time. I've been in political science since 1986, but most recently, most of my work is in philosophy. And I was interested to find that in a number of outlets, Milton Friedman had taken back, or at least amended, much of his claim about the obligation for corporations to maximize profits. He substituted corporations should maximize honest profits, which that adjective makes an enormous difference. And he tried to elaborate what that meant. So much of what I'm going to talk about tonight, I think, follows some of how Friedman rethought the original claim that corporations should simply maximize profits. Along the way, I'm going to make an argument for capitalism. And I may be wrong about this audience. This is a very fine school and you're well educated, but most places I go, I find that students are not capable of giving even the basic argument in favor of capitalism. I'm not saying that it's correct, but if you think it's incorrect, you should know what it is. So I'm going to, along the way, give the basic argument for capitalism and then problematize it a bit. But I did want to start out with that homage to Friedman because it was in part his rethinking that I had thought about 5 years ago that led me towards writing the book about Is Capitalism Sustainable, and in writing that article with Mario Villarreal-Diaz. So if you're going to start, you should start with Cicero. That's almost always true, and it's certainly true in this case. So Quintus Scaevola, the son of Publius, when he asked to have the price of an estate that he was buying named once and for all, the seller had complied with his request, said he thought it worth more, and added 100,000 sesterces. Now, this is archaic language. What's going on here? I come up to you, and I say, you've got a condo in New York City. How much do you want for it? And you say, well, like $400,000. And I said, oh, hell no. I'll give you $1 million. Said no one ever. Because seller beware. You're not obliged as the buyer to make sure that the seller is well informed. Now, there is no one who would say this was not the act of a good man, continuing to quote Cicero. But men in general, and this is from Of Duty, would not regard it as the act of a wise man. anymore if he had sold an estate for less than it would bring. So notice the distinction between what is good and what is wise. And so the question is there a conflict in capitalism between what is good and what is wise? The next sentence gives the game for Cicero. It's really interesting. This then is the mischievous doctrine. It's wrong. Regarding some men as good and others as wise. Now, how could it be that someone could be both good and wise? Can capitalism create a setting where you might be both good and wise? Or, as we find in this dichotomy here, is being wise always not good? Well, being an economist, or at least catechized as an economist, I want to state things in terms of a theorem, but it's a simple theorem. The if part of the theorem is, and I have to admit I made up a word, because philosophers and economists differ about their approach to voluntary exchange. Economists say, in a way that is question-begging, since exchange is voluntary. And philosophers rightly say, if exchange is voluntary. You'd have to actually be able to show that the exchange is voluntary before the consequences of that follow. Now, what do we know about a voluntary exchange? It makes both parties better off. If, in fact, both parties to the exchange are better off, then public policy should try to enable as many of these things as possible so that we can find better ways, more ways to serve each other. So that's the essential argument for laissez-faire economics. But wait, not so fast, green eye shade breath. In fact, we should be concerned about whether it's voluntary. So if you look up the word "voluntary," so I took the Greek prefix EU, meaning well or truly, I published a series of papers to define what is truly voluntary, and we can talk more about that later if you want. But let's suppose that exchanges are truly voluntary. And if profits are the excess of revenue over cost in a market without artificial constraints. Now, how would that work? Well, I go to input suppliers and I negotiate voluntary contracts with owners of labor, owners of capital, owners of plastic, steel, electricity, and in every case, I make them better off because it's a voluntary exchange. Every one of my contracts with input suppliers makes them better off. I then combine all of these inputs in my factory, and I sell them in output markets to consumers who are not obliged to buy it. Each of them are better off. If you've had an economics class, you know the definition of how much consumers are better off is consumer surplus, the difference between what they would pay and what they have to pay. So what is the consumer surplus for Facebook? Well, most of us don't have to pay anything, and the benefit of seeing other people's cat videos is gigantic. And so there's a lot of consumer surplus there. So the point is, already I have gone out and produced enormous value for society because every one of the input exchanges made the input suppliers better off, and every one of the sales in the output market has made consumers better off. But I've charged something for this product. You may not have ever thought of this, but one of the interesting things about economics is the way that it deals with disagreement. Any agreement on price reflects a disagreement about value. Any agreement on price must reflect a disagreement about value. If I own something and I sell it to you, you must value it more than that price, and I must value it less than that price. So the world is a better and more prosperous place with no increase in the amount of stuff, simply because the thing was moved from me to you. So that means that every voluntary exchange like that takes place makes the world a better and more prosperous place. Now, you might say yes, but it doesn't help everyone. That's why everyone has to be able to participate in this festival, this carnival of voluntary exchange. The more of those things happen, the more and the more better each of us is. So that's the argument for markets. Capitalism is a particular overlay on markets. Capitalism is a system of organizing division of labor using liquid capital. We raise liquid capital, which we can then direct at particular profit opportunities. And profit is a particular kind of price. Profit is the amount that I have left over after I have executed all of these contracts in the output market. I've sold all this stuff to consumers. I get a lot of money from that, and then I pay off the input suppliers. And I've made all of those people better off. If there's money left over, that's called profit. That's the benefit to entrepreneurship. If those two things are true, if exchanges are voluntary, and if profits are the excess of revenues over cost in a market without artificial constraints, then entrepreneurship is always virtuous. It's not wise, it's good. It is the habit of the alert seeking of exchange opportunities embedded in a character of forbearance of rent-seeking opportunities. So this is basically Israel Kirzner's definition of entrepreneurship, of alertness. So alertness is an Aristotelian virtue in the sense that it is a cultivated habit of the awareness of profit opportunities. I don't even have to think about it because I constantly pursue new profit opportunities. How do I know that's good for society? Because every exchange in the input market makes all the input suppliers better off, and every exchange in the output market makes all the consumers better off. If I have something left over, that's a signal that we need more of this social activity. So that's the argument for capitalism. As you can tell, the difficulties are likely to occur in the if part, because the then part actually follows if the two parts of the if part are satisfied. But what if exchanges are not truly voluntary? What if there's substantial disparities in bargaining strength? What if there's other things that prevent the exchange from being truly voluntary? What if, instead of profits being the excess of revenues over cost in a market without constraints, entrepreneurs pursue what are called rent-seeking opportunities? That is, they secure subsidies and favorable tax treatment from the government. Now notice, if I sell things to consumers, they have to be better off. If I sell things to Congress, nobody has to be better off because they got guns. They have tanks, they have attack helicopters. There's nothing that says if Congress gives me money that anybody is better off except me. But that's the problem. That still looks like profits in an accounting sense. I can increase my revenues by not selling to consumers, but by approaching Congress for favorable tax treatment and for subsidies. It's really hard to tell if you just look at the amount of profit. So profit alone is neither virtuous nor necessarily even wise for the system. So we're going to have to unpack that. And if we're going to unpack it, then I want to use the logic of capitalism itself. And this is the part that Friedman himself rethought. So there's two fundamental problems within the logic of capitalism itself that would suggest that the if part is not going to be satisfied. So the easiest way to think about it is, I'm an entrepreneur. I have two choices. I can hire more engineers and salespeople, or I can hire lawyers and lobbyists. Lawyers and lobbyists are not producing value. Well, for me they are, because they're producing profits. What they're doing is securing immoral but legal rents or increases in returns over the opportunity cost rate on return on capital. That's what rents are. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But I can secure undeserved profits by paying members of Congress to absolve me from my obligation to pay corporate taxes or sales taxes, or to give me subsidies, or to give me protection from foreign competition that costs domestic consumers. That's a transfer at gunpoint. So we have a manager. Let's suppose that we have a manager who studied under Israel Kirzner and is cultivated this Aristotelian virtue of awareness. And we say, we could really increase our profits if you would fire some of those engineers and hire lobbyists. And he says, well, that's true. That's legal, but it's not moral. And so I am a good person. If you think that's wise, you'll need somebody else. And we say, we accept your terms. You're fired. There's a competitive market for managers. There's somebody out there who is happy to fire engineers and hire lobbyists. So the fact that there is competition for managers means that we're likely to lose the good in favor of the wise in capitalist systems. Now, that's not some Marxist critique about contradictions. That is inherent in the capitalist system itself. It is the pursuit of profits that drives people to undertake the immoral but legal course of action that secures rents through government help. Second, suppose that we don't fire the manager. Well, our stock price is still depressed relative to where it could be if we were to fire the engineers and consumer workers and hire lawyers and lobbyists instead. So if I'm a corporate takeover artist, this is called the M&A market, mergers and acquisitions, I go to a bank and I say, look, they're returning 12% on capital. All I have to do is fire all the engineers and hire lobbyists. We could get 18% return on capital. I can pay you back this afternoon. Give me $10 million. Okay. Bankers are trying to increase the profit of their shareholders. They loan you the money because this is a sure thing. I take the money, I make a tender offer for the stock, and then as soon as I fire the good but not wise managers, I replace all the management of the corporation. Now we're making a higher rate of return because we have secured rents. But these do not involve selling to consumers. They involve selling to Congress. But now the stock price rises. One of the rules of finance is anything that's certain to happen tomorrow already happened yesterday. So as soon as this new person takes it over and says, you know what we're going to do? We're going to engage in massive legal rent seeking. And people say, I'm going to buy that stock because it's going to go up. And it does immediately. And I'm able to pay off the loan. Both of those things, the competitive market for managers and the market for mergers and acquisitions, are entirely within the logic of capitalism and profit seeking. Which is why Milton Friedman changed his mind and said honest profits. These are not honest profits. The question is, how could a system based on accounting profits discipline itself to select for the good and the wise? Well, I've noticed that defenders of capitalism, when I make this argument, and I think this is shameful, but people on my side are the ones who need to hear this argument. And so, of course, the analogy that occurs to me is Star Wars. If you saw Rogue One, these are the plans that were stolen about the Death Star. It seems like you could draw that with a crayon. So all those people died in order to secure these plans. And the plan, what the plan showed was, there's a big-ass hole in the Death Star. So it seems like you could have just flown by and noticed that. Should we cover the thermal exhaust ports? Nah, what's the worst that could happen? So at one point, actually, there's a big-ass hole in the Death Star. So Grand Moff Tarkin gets the bad news. We've analyzed their attack, sir, and there is a danger. How much analysis did it take? There's a hole. Should I have your ship standing by? And Governor Tarkin says, evacuate. In our moment of triumph, I think you overestimate their chances. So when I go to pro-market people and I say, I think there's a problem. I've analyzed the attack of the left and I think there's a problem. And they say, without exception, well, okay, we can make that argument about socialism. So when someone is opposed to socialism, they say, look at Venezuela. Socialism always becomes authoritarianism. And the response of people on the left is, well, that's not real socialism. And this is socialism under siege. And that's what happens when they're not able to participate in a larger socialist system. They had to spend too much on defense. And people on the right, pro-market people, say, yes, but socialism always becomes authoritarianism. And so you can't defend socialism because it's not sustainable. Okay. Sauce for the goose. Let's see how that argument works on capitalism. So, for example, this was a discussion on Medium. This was a person who had left several comments that were mostly positive, but said, in my opinion, the most important problem of capitalism you didn't mention is lobbying. And the immediate response of the person who had written the article, the original poster, oh, well, that's not capitalism. It's cronyism or corporatism. It's the opposite. Well, wait. If cronyism is what capitalism becomes in a democracy, isn't this the same argument that you find so persuasive when it's applied to socialism? So if the internal logic of capitalism leads it to become cronyism, then a semantic defense saying, well, that's not capitalism, is not sufficient. So when Betsy DeVos they were going to assign a contract to one company for student loans, the objection was, that's not capitalism, that's crony capitalism. Okay, that's not a defense. You've just renamed it. If that's the direction that capitalism takes, we actually have to take that argument seriously. We have analyzed their attack, and there may be a problem. And the response of the pro-market people is to say, evacuate in our moment of triumph? The point is, if the defense is always, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism, if you ask, what if cronyism is an essential feature in any democratic system that tries to be capitalist? I want to go all public choice on you. Public choice is an approach to political science and economics that makes the assumption that people in markets and in politics are primarily self-interested. Now, their notion of self-interest may be altruistic, public-spirited, but primarily they're trying to achieve objectives. People are goal-oriented. They're not mostly concerned for the public good. They have specific goals. Further, voters are mostly passive and rationally uninformed in the sense that they aren't very good at organizing, and they have a limited ability to become informed about the issues because their vote is one of many. And so people are motivated to vote. They're motivated to participate in politics. But if you ask people, can you name one Supreme Court justice? Can you name the senator from your state? Can you find Russia on a map? They can't do any of those things. And it makes sense that they can't because it doesn't matter for their lives. They show up and vote, but they're rationally uninformed about most things. So that's just an empirical description, but it is implied by public choice theory. Second, individual politicians benefit from cronyism. If I participate in a cronyist system, I increase the amount of campaign contributions and votes. And all I'm saying is politicians are motivated by self-interest in the sense they pursue re-election. Now, you might say, no, politicians pursue the public good. Let me ask it this way. If I'm a politician and if pursuing the public good does not get me reelected, what happens? I'm selected out. I'm gone. Only the politicians who pursue reelection are there after 2 or 3 elections. Now, it may be that that coincides with their perception of the public good, but primarily reelection is the goal of politicians. That's the system we've set up. I don't blame them for it. You can't blame a dog for eating out of the garbage. It's what dogs do. But that's the way the system works. Finally, individual corporate CEOs benefit from cronyism in the sense that they increase the short-run profitability of their corporations. They increase stock prices, they increase the value of their stock options. Now, you might say, okay, but it ruins the entire system. Fine, there's a competitive market for managers. It doesn't take many. We will find that they are replaced. Those 3 things together imply that capitalism has an inherent tendency towards cronyism. The only hope would be for one of these groups to act morally, recognizing that cronyism is harmful to the system. And in fact, the argument that many people in economics often make is that markets cause self-interest to be reconciled with the public interest. We don't depend on the beneficence of the butcher or the baker to provide us with our dinner. We provide on their self-interest. Well, what if their self-interest is to get government regulation that puts a price floor on meat and bread? Then not so much. Then their self-interest is actually harming us. It's not helping us, it's harming us. So the only hope would be for those groups to act morally. But that's virtue. And virtue is the one thing that I've said public choice theory will not allow us to assume. The whole point of public choice was you cannot assume a benevolent dictator. That was the way that public choice started. That James Buchanan and Gordon Tulik, they were objecting to the standard welfare economics model that said, well, step 1, assume a benevolent dictator. Well, all right, but if we can't assume a benevolent dictator, then I've analyzed their attack and there is a problem. So Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, Book 1, Chapter 10, This passage here is often cited as evidence that Adam Smith recognized there's a tendency towards cronyism. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. It is indeed impossible to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. And so corporate leaders are going to try to find a way to raise prices and restrict output. There's a tendency towards monopoly. But this passage goes on, and it's actually interesting in context. Though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. A regulation which obliges all of those in the same trade in a particular town to enter their names and places of abode in a public register facilitates such assemblies. Well, if you read The Wealth of Nations, who is it that Adam Smith expects to read this and learn from it? He thinks it's a manual for public officials. He's assuming that public officials are good. So, a regulation which enables those of the same trade to tax themselves, to provide for their poor, their sick, their widows, and orphans by giving them a common interest renders such assemblies necessary. In other words, a good public-spirited government official would not require meetings and trade associations because the consequence will be a tendency towards cronyism. But you can't defend capitalism by assuming a benevolent dictator. That was the point of public choice. And so the person Adam Smith is talking about may exist, but public choice says she does not. We cannot assume that. That's the one thing that we cannot assume. Which means that instead of saying, we won't make these meetings necessary, public officials read the first part of this and they're taking notes as a to-do list. The way to become cronyist is to require all sorts of trade associations and meetings. We'll have threats about increased taxes, and these industries will organize. And as a result, they'll be much better at cooperating and raising prices and restricting outputs. And yes, that's an implicit tax on consumers, but it's good for us because we'll get reelected. So, I'm not very good at Photoshop, I'm sorry. But this is Grand Moff Greenspan. Commander says, we've analyzed their attacks, sir, and assuming altruistic CEOs is silly, while invoking a benevolent government violates basic public choice theory. Should we just admit that capitalism is unsustainable? Okay, that never happened. But this did. This is a direct quote from Greenspan. Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. Basically, Alan Greenspan had said, evacuate now at our moment of triumph. I think you overestimate their chances. Except that then 2008 and 2009 happened. What happened in 2008 and 2009? What he's saying here is the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity. That should condition cronyism. It should limit the amount of cronyism. What form did the cronyism take? It took two forms. One was that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were obliged to create a market in securities that actually had values far less than their market price. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were charged by the government with making a resale market in mortgage-backed securities. The second thing that happened was that many large corporations took extremely long positions in these toxic assets. Now, why would they do that? Because they're really risky. Well, look at it from the perspective of a gambler in Las Vegas. There's a saying in economics that if I go bankrupt and I owe you $1 million, I'm in trouble. If I go bankrupt and I owe you $100 million, you're in trouble. If I owe you enough, you have to bail me out. Unsurprisingly, all of these large firms says, well, wait, let me get this straight. If we win, we get to keep the money. If we lose, you'll give us taxpayers' money. I think I know what I'm going to do. So that is self-interest. That is self-interest. Greenspan's mea culpa is nonsense. He has a notion of self-interest that assumes altruism and benevolence. I can increase my profits by taking extremely risky positions if the damage to the system is large enough. The mistake would be prudence. I can get the government to bail me out if I take a large enough risky position. So some of the examples that we've seen of collapsing cronyism were Solyndra. Solyndra had nearly $1 billion of taxpayer subsidies to make solar panels, and they never made any. They had the most amazing climbing wall in the employee cafeteria. It was a gigantic building that was never occupied or used. Over $1 billion was spent. A lot of people made money by doing it, and members of Congress were reelected by saying, we're for green energy. Look at this vote. Look at what we have done. But it was a gigantic cost for no benefit to consumers. Many people, when I talk to them about capitalism, will mention Martin Shkreli's raising of drug prices for a company that he had acquired. Now, the question is, how did Martin Shkreli do that? This was a generic drug. This was a drug that was off patent. So the patent had expired. It was a generic drug. Martin Shkreli acquired the rights to produce it because he had noticed some fine print in the Obama administration's regulation through the FDA of generic drugs. And it went like this. We need to get more control of generic drugs because we're not sure who's making them. So we're going to do two things. First, only companies that are licensed can produce generic drugs. Second, any other company that wants to produce generic drugs has got to get the permission of the incumbent company. What could go wrong? So Martin Shkreli got the right to produce this generic drug that people desperately needed that until now had been sold for $1 a pill. He raised the price to $800 a pill. And this is a generic drug. Other pump companies should be able to make it. They immediately tried. Martin Shkreli said, well, you haven't demonstrated there's actually enough need in the market. We have enough production capacity to be able to make enough of these things at $800 a pill. So for 2 years, he held up the entry of other companies using the regulations of the FDA against the entrants. Now, is that capitalism? No. Is it crony capitalism? Yes. Do you expect capitalism to survive? No. I use survive instead of sustainable as a Ben Rogie thing. So, might not a modern Hayek, but of the left, be tempted to write his own treatise, The Road to Crony Capitalism? The thesis would be that capitalism is not sustainable, and any attempt to set up capitalism in democracies is a step towards crony capitalism. So it's the same as the road to serfdom. It's just you're taking out some of the variables and doing a different kind of simulation. So if businesses maximize accounting profits, if politicians maximize power, including but not limited to re-election probabilities, if voters are poorly organized and poorly informed, then capitalism is unsustainable and always converts to cronyism. Now, I want to distinguish these two things because they seem really similar and they're not. Profits are the excess of revenues from selling a product after costs are subtracted. If the exchange is voluntary, each person buying the product must think she's better off. That's a voluntary exchange. Entrepreneurs seek profits and they try to create value. Rent-seeking is a competition for an artificial prize or benefit that's created either by taking money away from taxpayers and then trying to give it away, or a restriction on competition that allows an artificial increase in prices for products sold. Political entrepreneurs seek rents. No value is created. And the point is that capitalism has an inherent tendency towards rent-seeking. And you could say, yes, well, the government shouldn't allow that. Okay, you're assuming a benevolent dictator. It is in the self-interest of the members of government to do this. What would stop them from doing that? You having this moralistic response is just inconsistent with the approach that you advocate for understanding markets. It's logically incoherent. So, an example of rent-seeking, and this is just one that you should recognize, but I've always called it the Tulik Auction. Suppose I were to hold up a $20 bill and say, I'm going to auction off this $20 bill, but I'm going to do it in kind of a funny way. All of you have envelopes. Everybody put an amount of money in the envelope, and and put your name on it. Whichever envelope has the most money in it, I will give the $20 to that person. However, I keep all the money in all the envelopes. I can make $200 by auctioning off 20. That's what rent-seeking does. Okay, we're going to lower corporate tax rates. You guys line up. But I have to pay that lobbyist. Whether or not he secures this benefit for me, I have to pay that lawyer, whether or not she secures the part of the legislation that I wanted her to go after. If you walk down K Street in Washington, D.C., you see these they look like buildings. What they are is bids in a rent-seeking contest. I don't get that money back. That money is sunk. All of those rent-seeking bids are sunk. They are used up, whether or not I secure any benefit. So we have a giant part of our economy that is devoted, really smart people. Guys, well, honestly, they look like me. They have really good hair. 6'1", come and shake your hand, make eye contact. It's a little more like personal touch than you're really comfortable with. How you doing? You look good. Have you lost weight? Tell you what, you and Alice and Jane and I, we should go to Vail again. That was terrific. Why don't we go out on the houseboat again? How are the kids doing? And he knows their names. He knows your dog's name. This person has spent so much time and went to a top law school, has 20 years litigation experience. And his job is sucking up to you, a senator. And the thing is, he is producing enormous value by doing that for the company that has hired him. This is a perfectly rational system from every perspective except the public good. So, political entrepreneurs seek rents. No value is created. So when I said honest profit, economists write out the equation for profits as being pi is equal to the product of price times output, that is the price times the amount of stuff that I sell, which is a technologically determined function of the amount of capital and labor and other inputs that I use, minus the cost of capital, the interest rate minus the amount of capital that I've purchased, minus labor costs, the wages times the amount of labor that I've hired. So all of those things are voluntary in the idealized system that I had talked about. However, you might ask, all right, but which parts of those might I try to manipulate by getting government assistance? And the answer is all of them. All of them. I can make more profits by trying to get price supports. I can get more profits by trying to prevent my competitors from being able to sell products in this market, by getting an exclusive license, by introducing professional licensing so that in order to work as someone who does hair braiding, you have to have 1,500 hours of school, even though the people who do hair braiding don't actually use any chemicals. But it's a way of keeping prices high. It has nothing to do with benefiting consumers. It's just a way of keeping prices high. So every part of this is replete with opportunities for rent seeking. A rational economic actor will recognize that the marginal profitability of rent seeking exceeds the returns to the pursuit of honest profit. So that obviously calls out for a graph. Even if entrepreneurs forbear, a rational politician will recognize that power and electability can be improved by forcing a rent-seeking society on entrepreneurs. So, those two parts. The marginality condition is you invest in engineers and inventors, you invest in lobbyists and rent-seeking specialists until the last dollar devoted to each produces an equal increment to accounting profit. So you could write out the calculus and show at the margin the last dollar should be equal. The only way capitalism can survive then is if the last dollar devoted to honest profits is still more productive than the first dollar devoted to rent-seeking. So the promised graph. This is marginal profitability. This is investment spending. New companies, for the most part, mostly engage in the pursuit of honest profits. Microsoft, for a long time, didn't have any lobbyists. Uber basically still doesn't have any lobbyists, although they do have some now in state capitals. So a lot of relatively new companies really are just trying to increase market share and are much closer to the if and then part of my theorem. But mature companies fairly quickly recognize that they're in this part of the graph. So this horizontal line, I'm trying to simplify things, that's the first dollar reward to lobbying. So I'm not saying what the lobbying curve looks like, but the first dollar reward to lobbying has a certain level. If, no matter how much I spend on investment, then the return to private investment is still higher than the first dollar reward to lobbying, then capitalism would be sustainable. But that's just implausible. And I've already said why. And that's because politicians find rent-seeking useful. They push this up. This horizontal line, they push upwards. So rational capitalists invest in rent-seeking at the point that the first dollar return exceeds the marginal return to the pursuit of honest profit. And rational politicians push that first dollar return to lobbying up because it benefits them. Which means that we're always in this sort of picture, where there's at best some mix between the pursuit of honest profits and the pursuit of profits through rent-seeking. So I want to talk about one more thing, which is just rent extraction, and then I will take your questions. So let me skip ahead. Has anyone ever read The Reavers? Here's a concept called mud farmers. So mud farmers in Missouri, started to say Indiana, but this would never happen in Indiana. People are too honest. So in Missouri, I think actually it was in Kansas. I think the book actually takes place in Kansas. I'm going farther west. Some of y'all may be from Missouri. Farmers could plow their fields and water their crops, or they can plow the roads and water the roads. Why would they plow the road and water the road? Well, when a car comes by and they've plowed the road and watered the road and then covered it with straw, and it hasn't rained in 2 weeks, the car comes along and it sinks up to the axles in this mud that the farmer spent hours creating. And then the car is stuck up to the axles and the farmer comes out and says, "Car's stuck. Don't know how you're going to get out. Last guy was here a week." Somehow he's moved to Vermont. I don't know how. I can't do a Missouri accent. I just won't do any accent. I'm sorry. Bessie, my horse, and I will pull you out. Cost you $100. The car only costs $400. Are you kidding? Suit yourself. Comes out again tomorrow. Car still can't move. Finally, Bessie and the farmer pulled the car out. He pays the $100. Damn it. 2 miles later, it happens again. They end up spending $1,000 for a $200 car because they keep paying $100 to get out. Do they take that trip again? No, they do not. They did rise up and speak as if with one voice, and they did say, no, they do not take that trip again. Rent-seeking kills commerce. And so ultimately, the fact that it is in the short-run rationality of all these participants, the system turns more towards rent extraction. And so, well, again, another picture from the Reavers. They never did get out. Which raises the question of what the robber barons. You've probably heard of robber barons, but we usually apply that to the people who created trust in the late 19th century. But in fact, the original robber barons were people who built castles along the Rhine River. And there's a picture of one. You see a problem with that? Why would you build a castle on a slope where you could get up above it with an army and just roll rocks down on it? That's a really stupid place to build a castle. Except economics says you should probably look for the rational purpose underlying this equilibrium. They were not confused about where to build castles. We cannot go back and, oh, they're so dumb, they didn't know where to build castles. They knew exactly where to build castles. They built castles close enough to the river that they could put a chain across the Rhine River, and they could have a small cannon, because once the ship can't move because of the chain, if you have a small cannon, you can just blow this barge apart. And you say, I'm not going to spit again, but $100. Bessie and I will get rid of this chain that goes across the Rhine River if you give us $100. Well, the whole barge only cost $1,000. Suit yourself. So barge owners were paying $1,100, $1,200 for a barge that only had $1,000 worth of cargo. All traffic along the Rhine River stopped because of this rent-seeking activity. More and more castles that looked like this were built. And so they ended up having to tear down a bunch of castles. So now legislation tries to go through the K Street Gorge, where modern robber barons look out the windows. And they're holding up legislation which would be beneficial to the public, saying, you're going to have to pay me before it gets out. And when we say, well, no, we're not going to do that, well, me and Bessie, we can pull this legislation through the Ways and Means Committee if you just let us know. It'll cost you $100. Well, the benefit of the entire bill is only $1,000. Thanks for listening.
We're happy to take questions, so just raise your hand.
Or comments.
On the kind of earlier process, and with I know you touched on the managers and firing them over the aspect of just, oh, we'll get someone else to do it. Do you think that automation technology plays a role in this destabilization of capitalism? And like, where does the aspect of replacing man with machine kind of play into this?
It seems to me there are two causes for hope. I've given sort of an unrelentingly pessimistic picture. So to the extent that the economy is dynamic enough that we get a new constant inflow of new industries, new firms don't do this nearly as much. And one of the things that I don't know that you have noticed, there's been a big push recently for increases in minimum wage, because the increase in the minimum wage is supposed to help poor people. Does it? Used to be I would go into McDonald's and I would look up and there were some things written on the board and I would read them aloud. Big Mac, fries, large shake. And the person behind the counter would find the corresponding words on the cash register and press those buttons. Just turn the cash register around. Instead of me reading words and him punching there's a kiosk. All the people have lost their jobs now. So this idea that mostly favored, not surprisingly, by unions, none of whose workers are paid minimum wage. But if you can increase the cost of unskilled labor, you'll increase the demand for skilled labor. It's a substitute. So a lot of the support for minimum wages comes from people who don't make a minimum wage. There's been a catastrophic decline in the number of people employed in the service industry. Not long ago, I flew into Toledo, Ohio. Don't ask why. Toledo just happens sometimes. So I flew into Toledo, and I was late because I was flying on Delta, delayed every last time, always. And I got in about midnight, and I noticed there was a guy by the door ready to turn the lights out after I got my bag, and I thought, how am I going to get my car? My phone buzzed. And it said in slot 23A, your security code is a 4-digit code. I go out and there's a box. I punch in the code. 23A opens up. I get the key and I go off and I take my car. 3 people used to work in Toledo for Hertz. Now nobody does. So what it seems to me is happening is a fundamental transformation in work, where many of the people who used to make minimum wage are being laid off. And increasing minimum wage dramatically hastens, exacerbates that problem. So I think a dynamic process where we constantly get new firms partially solves the problem that I've raised. It doesn't solve the problem of replacing. So Mark Andreessen famously in 2011 said, software eats the world. Had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, software eats the world. So think of it this way. And I know you're tired, but wake up for a second. Software is to service jobs, as robotics and automation are to factory jobs. Software is to service jobs, as robotics and automation are to factory jobs. It destroys them. And so we're creating a permanent underclass. And that's not really a consequence of capitalism. That was why my book, Tomorrow 3.0, I claim we're in the middle of the third great economic revolution. And remember, in the first and second, the Neolithic Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, when Karl Marx looked out his window in 1848, the idea that the cities of Europe were on fire was not hypothetical. London, Berlin, Paris were literally on fire. We're pretty close to that. All it takes is a political demagogue who tries to blame, this could never happen, it's hypothetical, but who tries to blame immigrants or some other people and says that's the problem, not this fundamental change in economic revolutions. The difficulty that we have is economic revolutions don't care what we think of them. The question is, how could we mitigate that? And so I'm sorry this is such a long answer, but it's a good question. I think universal basic income is our only answer. We can't have payments that are contingent on unemployment. We have to have anti-poverty programs that allow people simultaneously to pursue work, because they're going to have to rethink the nature of work. We have to get rid of minimum wages, but we have to substitute universal basic income. That was the last chapter of the Tomorrow 3.0 book was, and I'm a libertarian, I don't come to this easily, but I think we're stuck. Universal basic income is our last best shot.
So you mentioned there's three major problems preventing us from achieving sustainable capitalism. Which of those three being fixed, per se, do you think is most likely?
This may be naive, but I think the answer is better voters. So I go around and give talks like this all the time, almost once a week. And I think most people, when they hear things stated this way, think, that's right. So when Russ Roberts and I were talking about this on a podcast called Econ Talk, Russ came up with an idea that I think is really clever. So people on the left often have lists of corporations that are ranked based on the level of social responsibility. So here's the most socially responsible corporations. Here's the least socially responsible corporations. Well, if I want to define social responsibility as eschewing, as saying no to rent seeking, why don't I put together a research project? And actually, the University of Texas Business School is considering doing this. What are the 15 biggest rent-seeking corporations? Because consumers might say, I'm not going to buy from them. I don't agree with that. If we can reduce the information cost to consumers, then we can make it more expensive for companies to pursue this short-run, not legitimate profit strategy. So I think more information to voters and a program that takes seriously my claim that rent seeking is not socially responsible is what I would advocate for. Now, it's not to say that that's going to change very much, but it doesn't have to change very much so long as my real hope, which is the constant creation of new businesses, allows us to keep treading water so it doesn't get worse. Facebook is going to disappear. I have a 2008 article, I think it was from the New York Times, that talks about the fact that this giant monopoly is going to be, we have to worry about it for the rest of our lives. And I can't think of the name of it now. What is the company that was before Facebook? MySpace. So literally 2008, MySpace is going to be a monopoly for the rest of our lives. It was gone pretty much by 2010. So by the time we start to worry about a company, it's usually become so corrupt that it's going badly. So Meta, their stock is just crashing. So long as we continue to have new companies, I think we have some hope. But we need to give voters better information.
Thanks. I wanted to ask how much your theory is dependent, or this account is dependent on public choice theory. It seems to me that K Street wants to motivate politicians to have a sense of self-interestedness, and that they could be conditioned otherwise. They could be otherwise motivated. Why don't we go that road and encourage more of a sense of the civil servant, the public servant, to get out of this?
That's a fair point, and I don't disagree. I think the way I've stated the theory is completely dependent on public choice theory. That's not the only theory that there is. So what I'm trying to do, remember what I'm trying to do, is to appeal to public choice people on the right and to say, we've analyzed their attack and there is a problem. If you believe what you say you believe, then here's the implication. To people who have other premises, yes, the problem itself is different. Maybe there's other solutions. But the reason that I think this is important is that many public choice people, and Milton Friedman himself, thought that the pursuit of profits was the only thing that corporations should do. I think you should not believe that. Now, if we want to have a broader view, that's great. And if we want to bring back a theory of virtue in public service, that would be great. And that's something I've actually written quite a bit about. I think that direction is important. But what I'm trying to do here is something pretty narrow. Public choice people have taken an incoherent position. And they have to say, we should evacuate because this is not our moment of triumph. We're going to have to come up with a better theory.
So how do major disruptions like climate change and world wars affect your theory?
Those are two really different ones. World wars are probably a benefit in the sense that they destroy. Now, that doesn't mean the policy implication is therefore we should have world wars. But Mansur Olson famously in The Rise and Decline of Nations in 1982 pointed out that most countries that have had really big growth rates, well, the mystery was, why was it that France, Germany, and Japan grew so much faster after World War II than the US and the UK? And the answer is all of the capital stock of those three countries was just blown apart. And the US and UK was mostly, their governments remained. Their government was not replaced. So what he talked about was what he called institutional sclerosis. That is this infestation, the accretion of promises to interest groups, mean that you have no latitude in public policy. And that's the position that the US is in now, is there's so many interest groups that are drawing from the public budget as if it were a commons. We're overfishing this commons. So world wars probably are helpful in the sense that they destroy these interest group systems and cause you to have to renegotiate all of these rents, and just having to reset that is beneficial. It doesn't mean that you should have a revolution or a world war. That's a bad idea. An ongoing threat like climate change provides an opportunity for rent seekers to come up with the sorts of coalitions that have been described by public choice people as Baptists and bootleggers. So the Baptist and bootleggers coalition has to do with somebody taking a moral position and somebody making a lot of money from them taking that moral position. So towards the end of what was going to be prohibition, some Baptists said, no, we should keep prohibition. And all of the bootleggers said, yes, we should keep prohibition because it keeps prices high. So Elon Musk has made a fortune. The stock of Elon Musk's company, Tesla, its value is more than Toyota. Why? What's the value proposition for Tesla? What are they selling? They're not, they break even on electronic cars. They're making money by selling carbon offsets. All of their money is being made by carbon offsets. What's a carbon offset? It is an absolution. You have sinned, my son. But if you say 10 Hail Marys and give me $5 million for this piece of paper that says carbon offset, you will be absolved. You will be able to go to heaven. So we created these artificial rights, and Elon Musk said, I know what to do with that. I can sell the hell out of that. So he did. So Solyndra took $1 billion and never made any solar panels. So the fact that there is a pressing, imminent crisis means that we're going to do some things that probably help. But it also is an invitation for a carnival of rent-seeking. Because all I have to do is tell a credulous story, pay me, and I will reduce the amount of carbon. We'll try it.
So I guess kind of follow up on that. Everything you've said so far is a little bit disparaging.
Yeah, I can't hear you very well.
Everything you said so far is a little bit disparaging. So how does the system go about solving public action problems like, I guess, climate change or bad water and so forth?
I think that we have a tendency to act as if things have gotten worse and not better. If you look at what what has happened in the U.S. since 1970, well, overall incomes have gone up dramatically, especially if you measure them correctly. If you look at the quality of cars, if you look at the fact that you have cell phones and then you didn't have cell phones, if you look at the record of public regulation of air pollution, if you look at safety regulation, we have achieved a lot of things through private action and through public action. But the narrative that you mostly get from the media is things really suck, they're getting worse, you should hide under your kitchen table in helpless fear. So I think taking account of the fact that we have had many successes, we have had a lot of very successful regulation. Instead of constantly saying, well, we all know that all the people, as was asked before, all the people who work for government, they're just bad. Well, in fact, there's a lot of things that's been accomplished that are pretty important. We should emphasize that, and we need to do more of it. So I think having that narrative where we actually look at the objective change in quality of life since 1970. And then if you expand this, Deirdre McCloskey has written about this. That's just for the US. If you look at China and India, in 1970, 80% of the people in China lived on less than $2 per day. Now that's less than 20%. The poverty rate has declined by 60% in China. It is the greatest mass improvement in welfare the world has ever seen. So I think that we need to recognize things have gotten a lot better. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems, but we need to emphasize the fact that we are capable of coming up with solutions, not doubting every solution by saying, well, you know how politicians are, they're all venal. So I've actually, if anything, that's sort of Pollyanna-ish. That's not disparaging. I actually think things have gotten way better. We should admit that, and we should take from that hope in strength.
So you mentioned that companies like Microsoft and Uber don't have lobbyists or didn't for a long time. How does your system explain these companies? Are they just a weird outlier?
No.
Okay, or is there something we're not seeing there?
Yeah. So Microsoft was, and now Microsoft as a mature company spends an enormous amount on lobbyists. And Uber will. So my claim is that new dynamic industries are our hope. The question is, will those continue to come up, or will regulatory policies squelch them? Because existing companies don't like those.
So, excuse my ignorance, right? But in your presentation, you mentioned how, socialism is bad. But right now, you just gave us.
I don't think I mentioned it. I said people assert that it is.
Thank you for the clarification. But you just gave us an example of a communist country where the poverty rate has decreased since the 1970s. So how will that make, I guess my question would be, how will that make capitalism more desirable if we see that other forms of maybe government or ideologies, I don't know how to characterize it, but that work to better the life development of individuals?
What communist country do you have in mind?
Well, you mentioned China.
Right, it's a capitalist country. Starting in 1973, the market reforms of Deng Xiaoping were China's a pure market economy.
Thank you.
Without corporate ownership. Without corporate ownership. Oh, yes.
So could you respond to the question?
Well, restate it. My question was, what communist country do you think has reduced poverty since 1970?
Okay, and so you gave us the example of China.
Which is not a communist country.
Until 73 was a communist country. So if there was enormous progress in 50 years under communism, why should we sustain capitalism?
There was not enormous.
Reduction of poverty.
China was constant and poor until 1973. It became capitalist and became rich. Sweden was social. A lot of times I'm always surprised at this. Bernie Sanders says, we should be socialist, like Sweden. The Swedish prime minister actually thought it was important enough that he said, please stop that. We were socialist until 1990. It turns out that socialism is not capable of producing enough income to be able to solve the poverty problem. Sweden backed off from socialism in 1990. They sold off all their state-owned enterprises. They dramatically increased access for the ability to produce new businesses. Sweden is more unequal than the United States. There are more billionaires per capita in Sweden than in the United States. There are more billionaires per capita in Sweden than in the United States. Sweden has a 100% voucher program for education, which is what Milton Friedman would have advocated for. So Sweden is one of the top 10 most capitalist countries in the world, except for its high tax rate and its welfare state. That's why I think we need universal basic income. I agree, we should be more like Sweden. Fiercely capitalist with a reasonably generous welfare state. But only capitalism produces enough income to be able to fund a welfare state. That was what Sweden shows.
My question is actually related to over here, your answer to that, and it's usually the reaction to a presentation like this, or the sentiment that capitalism tends to lead to cronyism, is you're right. That's why we need socialism, or why we need democratic socialism, and you argue for something much different than that, which is revising the system we have. How do you get people or convince people to start believing that rather than wanting to tear the entire system down?
But that was what we just did.
Okay.
My question
Just
is,
to
name
the
a
API.
single socialist country that has reduced poverty. There aren't any. There are no examples.
Is
First off, thanks for coming tonight. My question is, so when socialism hasn't worked, in the near aftermath of those countries, haven't we seen examples of crony capitalism? And so if crony capitalism has been so successful, like you mentioned, in the 50 years post-communist China, why does your theorem contradict it so strongly?
China was not very crony capitalist for a very long time because these were new industries. So you're probably bored with this. I keep coming back to it. What you need is a constant inflow of new industries. China didn't have a whole structure of interest group when rent seeking. So all of these companies between 1973 and 1980, they were all set up new. Russia, after it was socialist and they sold off all the state-owned enterprises, all of those big companies went to the oligarchs of the former Russian regime. They never moved towards capitalism. It became crony capitalism immediately. And so that was catastrophic. Now, I should be careful. I have used the word socialism without defining it. By socialism, I mean the literal state ownership of the means of production. I don't mean democratic socialism where you have more worker participation in the ownership of management of, because Sweden does that. So if that's what you mean by socialism, then okay. But those are private companies. They're not owned by the state. So I should be careful about what my definition of socialism is. By socialism, I mean the literal state ownership of the means of production. There are no examples of a country that has universal state ownership of the means of production solving the problem of poverty since 1970. The record of the Soviet Union although there's the mass genocide of the Ukrainians, but the Soviet Union grew very fast for quite a long time under socialism, but not after 1970. Capitalism has outpaced it with 19. So those two caveats. I'm talking about after 1970, and I'm giving a particular definition of socialism that might be tendentious, because it's not what Bernie Sanders meant by socialism. So I'm criticizing him, but then I'm substituting a different definition.
Thank you for a very, very highly interesting presentation. And thank you for providing the definition for socialism. That was helpful. Would you be able to provide your definition for welfare state? And what do you think, what is the aspect of moral backbone or the role of religion in there? Because there is a theory which is in Scandinavia and in Finland, which are kind of the welfare states, that the role of Lutheran faith present in those. So would you like to comment on that?
I don't have much to say about that. My view of a welfare state is, well, let me put it this way. I'm not worried about inequality. A lot of people are worried about inequality. I don't understand that. What I am worried about is poverty. And so to the extent that we create a large enough surplus that redistributive taxation and being able to spend on universal basic income raises the welfare level of those who are least well off and allows them to participate as more or less equals in society, in the sense that they have access to the vote, they have access to education, they have access to health care. That doesn't mean that everybody has a yacht. So I'm not worried about inequality. What I am worried about is the level of those who least well off. So if you look for the United States, the world income distribution, what is it that someone who has a minimum wage job in the United States, where are they in the world income distribution? And the answer is right at the 80th percentile. That is, they're among the 20% most wealthy people in the world if you have a minimum wage job in the United States. So probably by historical definitions, they're not poor. However, it does seem like the United States could afford to have a better delivery system for anti-poverty programs. We spend a lot on anti-poverty programs. We just don't give it to the people who need it. So when I say we need universal basic income, I've had friends on the left or the right say, we can't just give them the money. You know how they are. Really, do tell. How are they? They'll spend it on things they think they need. You want to substitute your own judgment for that. So to me, a welfare state is something like financial autonomy for those who are least well off. I don't know what the correct level is, but we could do better than we're doing now because we're wasting a giant amount on anti-poverty programs that are not being delivered. And that may just not have addressed your question, because I think welfare state is that is a loan word that I have taken. It means something very different in the Scandinavian countries, partly because there is more of a sense of shared destiny among the people in the Scandinavian countries. In the United States, people tend to identify poor people as being from another race. They're immigrants. We don't care about them. It's harder to get that sense of shared identity.
So you anticipated my objection. I raised my hand right when you said there was no other successful case, and I was going to point out the Soviet example. I would point out, too, that their standards of living have dramatically decreased since the introduction of capitalism in the former Soviet bloc.
That's cronyism. It's not capitalism.
I thought, didn't you start off your whole talk saying you can't do that? Okay.
Damn it! I can see I'm no match for you.
Okay, another semantic question is whether China counts as a communist country or a capitalist country. They're run by the Communist Party, which is not a democratic institution. And I wonder if, in your standards, they would count as the benevolent dictator that you usually can't assume.
And if not China, then Singapore.
I was going to say Singapore too. Or maybe even the EU with some of its anti-democratic
Yep.
things. Is one solution to just not do democracy?
I've been careful to say capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. You've taken things in a whole new and interesting direction. Obvious answer is not to get rid of capitalism. The answer is to get rid of democracy. He didn't say. But it is clearly possible if you have the sort of central government that Hong Kong had for a long time, that Singapore has. Capitalism is sustainable because the government does not sell rents and favorable policy. The problem is that as a liberal, I cannot have a solution that is not also democratic. Both of those kinds of liberty for me are required. I'm constrained. So yes, it is an answer. And if you were willing to be dictator and the United States were willing to appoint you as dictator, I would be happy with that. I might even, no. But that's not how it happens. Furthermore, dictatorships have the problem of succession. And China didn't have that problem. It was a pretty effective meritocracy in the sense that you couldn't serve more than 2 terms and then we're going to select someone else from the party. That's not true now. We have a president for life in China. So I think China's going to have a problem with succession now that they've broken that rule. The decision to break that aspect of the Constitution is catastrophic. But yes, you're absolutely right. You could say democracy is the problem. It's just one could say, you didn't. One could say democracy is the problem. Not capital. And in fact, I have had a lot of people, what we need to do is get rid of democracy. Think what you're saying.
So I have a question. It's a little half-baked. Maybe it's...
Like it stopped the rest of them.
Yeah. So I'm kind of thinking the Tulik paradox, right, where you have the obvious outcome of the competitive process within the rent-seeking thing is to say that profits in rent-seeking are going to get pushed to zero. But empirically, we don't really see that, or at least haven't seen that. Is that a reason for optimism, or are we just higher up on your curve before the unsustainable part still? I think it's coming on that.
Tulik often remarked on the fact that he found it strange that political contributions were so small. Because it seems like if this theory is correct, then in terms of profitability, you should just be aiming fire hoses of cash at Congress. And we don't actually do that. Even after Citizens United, it's not that much money. We spend more on advertising yogurt and toothpaste than we do on all political advertising combined. Now, yogurt and toothpaste are important, but we don't spend enough for this theory to be able to claim legitimacy, I think. People are good. Many people, in fact, do not engage in this sort of behavior, and many members of Congress say, no, that's wrong. I'm not going to do that. So Tulik has a famous an interesting little paper called A Partial Rehabilitation of the Public Interest Theory. It was published in 1981 in Public Choice. It's famous to me because I always talk about it, but it's not very widely cited, in which he said basically your point from before, the fact is there's a whole lot of people who care about the public interest, and that's sort of the baseline. So we could talk about changes in price and variations around that baseline, and that's what economics always does. We don't say, how much do people like ice cream? What we say is, given how much they subjectively like ice cream, we expect the quantity demanded to respond to price and income. So we have these parameters and it causes it to vary. In fact, most people in the United States still pretty much believe in the sanctity of the system. They should not engage in rent seeking, and they don't. The system varies around that level, which is determined by the public interest. That's right. So I really am trying to be critical of public choice theory by showing that it is self-negating on its own terms. And that may not be something that interests you because you would have believed that like an hour and a half ago and we could have been drinking.
We probably have time for one more. Anybody?
It's a lot of pressure.
So you claim that a way to fix rent seeking is more informed voters. Do you see that being a problem if politicians catch on to these more informed voters to maybe manipulate the voting process like they have before through gerrymandering or any strategies like that?
If politicians don't, there's a competitive market for politicians. So those who now control power will find other politicians who will. So it is very difficult to achieve that sort of change. And gerrymandering in particular is really astonishing, the extent to which it's... Now, it always surprises me the two most gerrymandered states in the US are Maryland and North Carolina. You don't hear much about Maryland because it's controlled by the Democrats. But there's no essential difference between the amount of gerrymandering in those two states. They're both incredibly egregious. And every time one party is control of a state legislature, all they have to do is pass a law saying we have a set of principles to eliminate gerrymandering, contiguity, you have to include parts of cities, you don't want to break up counties. It's pretty easy to do. But very few majorities are willing to do that because they know that the amount of time that they have control is pretty short. It's actually going to take a referendum process or some kind of initiative, I mean that in two senses, from voters in order to force politicians to do that. But I don't think it's impossible. The awareness of gerrymandering now as an egregious problem is more than any time I've ever seen it in my lifetime. And it may be because the extent of gerrymandering is so great. But it's catastrophic. People are just being disenfranchised in my state.
Okay, well, I want to encourage everyone to come to our talk at lunch tomorrow with Professor Kotsko, who will give a different perspective on beyond capitalism. I get the title right. And then if you have more questions for Professor Munger and or Professor Kotsko, that's the purpose of the panel early tomorrow evening. So if you didn't get a chance to ask a question today, you can still have a chance. So come back to our events tomorrow.
Or may I say one thing? My new book, The Sharing Economy, that's published by the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, is available for free as a PDF. So if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you a PDF of the book.
Yeah. Okay, so more importantly, you can go on in thanking Professor Munger. All right. Thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow.